The wind howled to the jagged peaks, carrying the bitter promise of an early, merciless winter. High on the rotting shingles of an isolated cabin, a fragile silhouette fought a losing battle against a freezing downpour. Clara, a slender widow condemned by a town that never bothered to understand her tragic past, drove a rusted nail into the wet wood, her delicate hands entirely numb from the frost. She was utterly alone, swallowed by the roaring storm, until a massive shadow emerged from a blinding rain. A towering cowboy with shoulders broad enough to carry the world sat atop a midnight stallion, his piercing eyes locked onto her desperate struggle. In a harsh world that had left her freeze, Elias was about to bring the fire. If you love stories of redemption, warmth, and healing, settle in and subscribe to Cowboy Echoes, where the heart of the West beats on. The rain fell like shards of shattered glass against Clara Vance's pale skin as she clung to the slippery cedar shakes of her decaying roof. Below her stretched the sprawling, indifferent expanse of Oakhaven Valley, a place that had once promised sanctuary but had instead become her sprawling, inescapable prison. Clara was a woman whose breathtaking beauty had always been a quiet curse. Her delicate, aristocratic features, her profound, sorrowful eyes, and her graceful, slender frame drew stares that offered harsh judgment rather than compassion. When her husband Arthur died 2 bitter winters ago, he did not leave her with fond memories or a comforting legacy to keep her warm. He left her with crushing debts and a name entirely ruined by his reckless gambling, his drunken brawls, and his broken promises to the unforgiving men of the valley. The townsfolk of Oakhaven, a righteous and tightly knit community, had swiftly turned their backs on the fragile widow. They saw her not as an innocent victim of terrible circumstance, but as a lingering, unwanted reminder of scandal they preferred to bury in the dust. When she walked the narrow aisles of the local mercantile to trade her meager, hand-stitched garments for flour and salt, conversations would abruptly die, replaced by cold glares and hushed, venomous whispers. She had learned over the excruciating months to make herself completely invisible, wrapping her tattered wool shawl tightly around her trembling frame, hiding the luminous, cascading waves of her dark chestnut hair beneath a faded, unadorned bonnet. She carried the heavy burden of their collective scorn in complete silence, convinced in the darkest corners of her heart that she was entirely unworthy of kindness, a solitary ghost haunting the wreckage of her own life. Now, as the merciless autumn tempest battered the frail timbers of her isolated homestead, Clara fought a desperate, lonely war against the elements. The wind roared like a wounded beast, threatening to tear her from her precarious perch high above the muddy earth. Her slender fingers, purple and trembling violently from the biting frost, fumbled blindly with rusted iron nail. She raised a heavy wooden mallet, bringing it down with all the fading strength her weary, starving body could muster. The strike was clumsy and weak, glancing off the flat nail head and smashing painfully against her own thumb. A sharp gasp escaped her blue, trembling lips, swallowed instantly by the deafening crack of thunder that rattled the very bones of the valley. Tears of pure frustration and profound, soul-crushing exhaustion mingled with the freezing rain streaming down her porcelain cheeks. It was not just a physical agony radiating through her frozen hand that broke her resolve, but the crushing, suffocating weight of her absolute solitude. There was no one to call out to for help, no warm, crackling hearth waiting below, no gentle hand to pull her back from the edge of the storm. She was entirely alone in the world, fighting a losing battle to keep a leaking roof over a hollow home that held nothing but cold shadows and bitter, inescapable memories. She pressed her freezing forehead against the wet, rotting shingles, her dark hair plastered to her delicate face in heavy, soaked ribbons. The chilling realization washed over her, colder and more absolute than the torrential downpour. She was losing. The cold had seeped deep into her marrow. Her legs, soaked completely through the thin, threadbare cotton of her worn morning dress, were completely numb and useless. The mallet slipped from her lifeless, unfeeling grip, clattering loudly down the steep pitch of the roof and disappearing into the dark, muddy abyss below. Clara closed her eyes, the sheer exhaustion pulling at her spirit like a heavy iron chain dragging her toward the bottom of a deep river. A quiet, terrifying surrender began to bloom within her aching chest. Perhaps it would be easier to just let go, to loosen her frozen fingers, to let the merciless storm claim her and wash away the endless, humiliating struggle, the unpayable debts, the unbearable, crushing loneliness. She felt her precarious grip on the slippery was beginning to fail, her fragile body slowly sliding toward the edge of the roof. But then a deep, resonant sound cut through the howling fury of the wind. It was not the rolling thunder, nor the desperate, groaning timbers of her failing cabin. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud of massive hooves pounding against the saturated, muddy earth. Clara weakly turned her heavy head, peering through the blinding, gray curtain of rain. Down in the flooded yard, standing like an unmovable mountain carved from the very storm itself, was a massive midnight black stallion. Astride the magnificent beast sat a man of imposing, intimidating stature, the water cascading in sheets off the wide brim of his dark Stetson. He was a complete stranger to her, yet his presence radiated an undeniable, overwhelming force of nature that commanded the chaotic elements swirling around him. The towering cowboy did not shout over storm. He did not frantically wave his arms. He simply sat there in the torrential downpour, his incredibly broad shoulders square beneath a heavy canvas duster, his intense, shadowing gaze piercing directly through the gray veil of rain and locking onto her fragile, defeated form. Time seemed to fracture and slow to a haunting, suspended crawl as his steady eyes held hers, conveying a silent, unyielding demand that she hold on for just a moment longer. Clara felt a strange, terrifying jolt deep in her chest, a sudden, inexplicable spark in the freezing darkness of her despair. Her numb fingers dug desperately back into the wet wood, halting her slide. Who was this silent giant of man? And why did his unwavering gaze suddenly make the peaceful prospect of giving up feel entirely impossible? Elias Thorne was a man forged by the relentless hammer of the western frontier, a solitary figure who had spent the better part of his 35 years taming wild horses and driving restless herds across plains that swallowed weaker men whole. He had come to the secluded valley of Oakhaven, seeking nothing more than profound, unbroken silence of mountains, purchasing the sprawling, untamed acreage that bordered the dilapidated Vance property. Down in the town saloon, the men spoke of the widow Vance with cruel, casual disregard, painting her as a tragic, cursed nuisance better left entirely alone. But as Elias sat motionless atop his magnificent black stallion, rain lashing against his rugged, weathered face, he did not see a cursed nuisance. He saw a breathtakingly fragile creature, fiercely and stubbornly clinging to life, fighting a brutal, unwinnable war against a merciless sky. The heavy, rusted ladder Clara had used to scale the rotting structure lay shattered in the churning mud, violently blown down by the shifting gales. Elias did not waste a single, precious second searching for another way up. He swung his massive frame down from the saddle, his heavy leather boots sinking deep into the flooded earth, and strode toward the fragile cabin with the unstoppable, deliberate momentum of a rising tide. Every movement he made was heavy with quiet, dangerous power, completely unbothered by the freezing torrents that threatened to wash the very soil away. He reached the low, sagging overhang of the porch roof, his broad, calloused hands gripping the slick, rotting wood. With a sudden, terrifying display of raw physical strength, the towering cowboy pulled his immense weight upward, his heavily muscled shoulders bunching beneath his soaked canvas duster as he hauled himself onto precarious, sloping pitch. The ancient timbers groaned in violent protest beneath his heavy boots. But Elias moved with the sure, predatory grace of a mountain cat, stalking to the high timber. He navigated the treacherous, slick shingles with absolute, terrifying certainty, his dark, piercing eyes locked exclusively on the small, trembling silhouette huddled desperately near the peak. As he closed the terrifying distance between them, the sheer, devastating reality of her condition struck him like a physical blow. Clara was a vision of tragic, haunting beauty. Her pale skin translucent and shivering violently, her lips tinted a dangerous, icy blue. Her dark, heavy hair clung to her delicate jawline and soaked, freezing ribbons in her wide, sorrowful eyes stared up at him, clouded with profound, quiet terror in the heavy, intoxicating fog of hypothermia. She looked as though a single, strong gust of wind might shatter her completely, scattering her fragile pieces into the storm. Elias dropped heavily to one knee beside her, his massive presence instantly blocking the brutal, driving force of the wind. Without a single word of hesitation, his large, rough hands moved the heavy horn buttons of his thick, fleece-lined wool coat. He stripped the massive garment from his wide shoulders, exposing himself to the biting, merciless frost, and leaned deeply into her personal space. Clara shrank back instinctively, a small, frightened gasp escaping her frozen lips, terrified by the overwhelming size of the man and the sudden, suffocating proximity of his broad chest. But his movements, despite his intimidating, towering stature, were incredibly slow, profoundly gentle, and entirely deliberate. He wrapped the heavy, dry wool completely around her trembling, slender frame, pulling the thick collar up to shield her freezing face. The sheer, shocking weight of the coat settled over Clara like a heavy, protective fortress. An immense, radiating heat instantly bled to the freezing layers of her soaked morning dress, carrying with it the deeply masculine, intoxicating scent of pine needles, worn saddle leather in the wild, untamed rain. It was a warmth so profound, so entirely unexpected in her desolate, empty world, that it drew a ragged, broken sob from deep within her aching chest. "You're freezing," Elias rumbled, his voice a deep, vibrating baritone that resonated beneath the deafening crash of the thunder, vibrating through the very soles of her numb feet. It was not a question, nor was it a judgment. It was a simple, grounding statement of fact, spoken with a quiet, undeniable authority that demanded her absolute surrender. Before Clara could process the profound command in his deep voice, his massive arms wrapped securely around her fragile, coat-swayed body. One thick, muscular arm slid beneath her shivering knees, the other wrapping firmly around her slender back. With a smooth, effortless motion that defied gravity, Elias stood tall upon the slick, dangerous roof, pulling her entirely against the hard, unyielding expanse of his chest. Clara gasped, her face instinctively pressing into the warm, damp cotton of his shirt. She felt impossibly small, entirely weightless in his powerful grip, completely at the mercy of this giant stranger who held her life so casually in his massive hands. The descent was a terrifying, chaotic blur of driving rain and howling wind, but Clara did not slip. She was anchored to a mountain of a man who did not falter, his heavy boots finding impossible purchase on the rotting wood as he climbed down the side of the fragile porch, dropping the final few feet to the flooded earth with a heavy, splashing thud that rattled her very teeth. He did not set her down in the freezing mud. He carried her swiftly across the yard, his long, powerful strides eating the distance to her front door. Raising one heavy mud-caked boot, Elias kicked the swollen wooden door violently inward, the rusted hinges screaming as they gave way to his overwhelming force. He stepped out of the roaring storm and into the suffocating, freezing darkness of her empty home. The cabin was as cold as a tomb, smelling faintly of stale ash and damp, rotting wood. Elias moved directly to a worn, rocking chair position near the dark, empty hearth, lowering Clara into the seat with a careful, painstaking gentleness that directly contradicted his brutal, rugged exterior. He did not step away. He remained hovering over her for a long, heavy moment, his dark eyes scanning her pale, shivering face, ensuring she was still breathing, still fighting. Turning his broad back to her, the massive cowboy dropped his knees before the blackened fireplace. He pulled a dry match from a brass case in his pocket, striking it sharply against the stone. Within moments, he had coaxed a small, desperate flame into a roaring, crackling fire, feeding it heavy logs from a meager pile nearby. The golden, dancing light instantly flooded the small room, casting long, towering shadows against the peeling walls. Elias slowly rose to his full, intimidating height and turned back to face her. The warm firelight caught the harsh, compelling angles of his jaw, the deep, weathered lines around his intense eyes, and the quiet, dangerous stillness that seemed to radiate from his very core. Clara sat paralyzed in the oversized coat, her heart hammering violently against her ribs, completely trapped in the suffocating, heavy silence of the room. The storm raged relentlessly outside, but inside, a different, far more terrifying kind of tension was rapidly building. She was entirely alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, locked in a small, glowing room with a massive, powerful stranger who had just saved her life. As his dark, unwavering gaze drifted slowly down her trembling form, Clara swallowed hard, a burning, desperate question echoing in the silent, heavily charged air. What exactly did this dangerous, towering man want in return? The heavy, suffocating silence of the cabin stretched between them, thick and fraught with an unspoken, terrifying tension. Outside, the merciless storm battered the flimsy wooden walls, the wind howling like a chorus of condemned souls. But inside, the only sounds were the violent, rhythmic chattering of Clara's teeth and the sharp, snapping hiss of the newly built fire. Elias stood motionless near the hearth, a towering, shadowed monolith in the flickering, golden light. The water dripped steadily from the wide brim of his dark hat and pooled silently around his heavy leather boots, a stark reminder of the brutal world he had just pulled her from. Clara clutched the lapels of his massive, fleece-lined wool coat tightly beneath her chin, her wide, sorrowful eyes tracking his every subtle movement. She was entirely at his mercy, a fragile bird trapped in the snare of a massive, unreadable predator, waiting with a heavy, pounding heart for the inevitable blow to fall. In her bitter experience, men did not offer kindness without exacting a cruel, devastating price in return. But the towering cowboy did not step toward her with demanding arrogance, nor did his intense, shadowing gaze hold a single trace of the ugly, familiar hunger she had come to expect from the desperate men of Oakhaven. Instead, a profound, quiet concern etched deep lines around his dark eyes. He slowly raised his large, callous hands in a universal gesture of peace, completely disarming the raw, defensive fear radiating from her trembling frame. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he stated, his deep, rumbling voice cutting through the heavy silence with gentle, yet undeniable authority. "If that freezing dress stays against your skin, the fire will not save you. I will turn my back." Before Clara could form a single word of protest or gratitude, Elias pivoted on his heavy heel, presenting the impossibly broad, unmoving expanse of his back to her. He stepped toward the small, frosted window, staring out into the blinding, churning darkness of the tempest, giving her an absolute, respectful privacy that left her entirely stunned. She sat paralyzed for a long, agonizing moment, staring at his wide shoulders, waiting for the trick, waiting for him to turn around and mock her profound vulnerability. When he remained as still as a mountain carved from solid granite, a shaky, ragged breath escaped her pale lips. Her slender fingers, numb and clumsy from the biting frost, fought a frustrating, desperate battle against the tiny, soaked buttons of her dark morning dress. Every movement was a sheer agony, the freezing fabric clinging stubbornly to her shivering, translucent skin. It felt like an eternity before the heavy, ruined garment fell in a wet pool around her bare ankles. Trembling violently in the frigid air, she reached for a thick, faded patchwork quilt draped over the nearby bed, wrapping it tightly around her slender, chemise-clad body, pulling the massive wool coat back over her shoulders like an impenetrable, heavy shield. "I am ready," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread that barely carried over the crackle of the blazing hearth. Elias turned slowly, his dark, piercing eyes sweeping over her bundled, shivering form. He did not let his gaze linger inappropriately. Instead, his intense focus was entirely locked on the dangerous, icy blue tint that still stained her delicate lips and the violent tremors racking her fragile body. He moved to his discarded canvas duster, pulling a battered metal canteen and a small tin cup from the deep pockets. Stepping back to the fire, he poured a measure of water into the cup and set it carefully on a flat stone directly beside the roaring flames. The slow, methodical nature of his actions possessed a strange, mesmerizing quality, wrapping the chaotic, freezing room in a profound, grounding calm. When the water began to lightly steam, Elias wrapped a thick leather glove around his large hand. Lifting the hot tin cup, he crossed the short, agonizing distance between them, dropping heavily to one knee directly in front of her rocking chair. He was so close that she could feel the radiating, immense heat of his large body, could smell the intoxicating, wild scent of rain-soaked earth and raw masculinity clinging to his skin. He held the steaming cup out to her, his intense, dark eyes locking onto hers with an unwavering, silent command to drink. Clara reached out from beneath the heavy layers of the quilt, her delicate hands shaking so violently that the hot water threatened to slosh over the rusted brim. She was entirely incapable of holding it steady, her frozen muscles refusing to obey her desperate mind. A hot, humiliating tear slipped down her porcelain cheek, a silent testament to her profound, crushing weakness. Without a single word of pity, Elias set his gloved hand aside. He reached out with his bare, massively calloused hands, gently wrapping his thick fingers completely over hers, encasing her fragile, trembling hands in a cage of overwhelming, radiating heat. Clara gasped sharply, her breath hitching in her throat at the sudden, shocking contact. His skin was incredibly rough, scarred by years of brutal labor and punishing elements. Yet his touch was profoundly, painstakingly gentle, holding her with the careful reverence one might offer a shattered piece of precious, antique glass. "Drink slowly," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating through the quiet space between them. He guided the tin cup to her trembling lips, tipping it with a careful, measured precision. The warm water slid down her raw, freezing throat, a sudden, blinding rush of heat that seemed to awaken the very core of her dormant spirit. She drank until the cup was empty, her wide, sorrowful eyes never leaving his rugged, weathered face. He did not pull away when she finished. Instead, he set the empty cup aside on the wooden floorboards and kept his large, warm hands firmly wrapped around her freezing fingers. The silence that descended upon them was no longer heavy with terror, but charged with a sudden, overwhelming intimacy that made Clara's heart race with an entirely different kind of fear. He began to slowly, rhythmically rub her cold, bruised hands, his heavy thumbs tracing the delicate, fragile bones of her wrists, coaxing the stagnant, freezing blood back into her numb extremities. The sheer, physical contrast between them was breathtaking, his massive, dark hands completely swallowing her pale, slender fingers. As the deep chill began to finally retreat, a sharp, agonizing throb of returning circulation flared through her hands. Clara winced, a small sound of pain escaping her lips. She tried instinctively to pull away, to hide her suffering as she always did. But his grip, though incredibly gentle, was completely unyielding. "It hurts when the warmth comes back," Elias said softly, his dark eyes holding profound, ancient understanding. "You just have to endure the thaw. It means you are still alive." His words struck a deep, hidden chord within her shattered soul. He was speaking of her freezing hands. But the profound resonance of his deep voice seemed to echo into the darkest, most broken corners of her heart. For 2 agonizing years, she had been completely frozen, locked in a bitter, solitary winter of public scorn and crushing grief. The righteous people of Oakhaven had looked right through her, treating her as nothing more than an invisible, shameful ghost. Yet this towering, dangerous stranger saw her perfectly. He did not look at her with disgust, nor did he look at her with pity. He looked at her as if her fragile life was something inherently valuable, something entirely worth saving from the storm. A fresh wave of tears welled in her beautiful, sorrowful eyes, not from the physical pain of the frostbite, but from the sudden, overwhelming shock of simple human compassion. The thick, icy walls she had meticulously built to survive the valley's cruelty were beginning to dangerously crack beneath the relentless, steady heat of his massive hands. "My name is Clara," she whispered, the confession feeling like a tremendous, monumental surrender. "Elias," he replied, his low voice wrapping around her name like a physical embrace. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of golden sparks up the blackened chimney, casting dancing, intimate shadows across their faces. Elias remained kneeling before her, his large thumbs continuing their slow, mesmerizing circles against her warming skin. The storm raged on outside, an unyielding, violent beast tearing at the fragile edges of the world. But inside the small, glowing radius of the hearth, a terrifying, beautiful gravity was pulling them inexorably together. As Clara stared down at their joined hands, a heavy, paralyzing question settled deep in her chest. She was a ruined woman, a widow wearing the dark, inescapable stain of a dead man's sins. When the morning light finally broke, and this powerful, quiet giant learned the truth of her disgraceful standing in the valley, would he drop her hands in disgust, leaving her to freeze in a cold far more bitter than any winter storm? The pale, golden light of dawn broke across the jagged peaks of Oakhaven Valley, filtering through the frosted panes of Clara's small window like the soft, muted strokes of an old oil painting. The brutal storm had finally exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world washed clean and shivering in the crisp, biting air of late autumn. Clara slowly opened her heavy eyes, disoriented by profound, unfamiliar warmth that completely enveloped her. She was lying in her own bed, the thick, faded patchwork quilt tucked securely around her shoulders. But the heavy, comforting weight draped over her feet was the unmistakable, fleece-lined wool coat belonging to Elias Thorne. She lay perfectly still, listening to the quiet breathing of the cabin. The fire had been meticulously banked, glowing with a steady, enduring heat that chased away the bitter dampness she had lived with for 2 agonizing years. A sudden, sharp panic seized her chest as she realized the room was entirely empty. The massive, quiet stranger who had pulled her from the edge of oblivion was gone. The heavy, suffocating weight of her reality rushed back in, reminding her that men like him did not linger in places tainted by disgrace and ruin. She swung her slender legs over the edge of the bed, her feet finding the cold wooden floorboards. A familiar, hollow ache settling deep within her chest. But then a rhythmic, booming sound echoed through the crisp morning air. It was a heavy, deliberate strike of a hammer against solid wood, coming directly from the roof above her head. Clara quickly pulled on a dry, faded cotton dress, her trembling fingers rushing over the small buttons, and wrapped her frayed wool shawl tightly around her delicate shoulders. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping out onto the small, sagging porch. The world outside was brilliant and blinding, the wet earth sparkling beneath the rising sun, but Clara's gaze was instantly drawn upward. Elias Thorne was standing near the peak of her rotting roof, completely illuminated by the cinematic, golden hour light. He had discarded his heavy canvas duster, working only in his dark trousers and a simple, pale cotton shirt that clung tightly to the massive, shifting muscles of his broad back. He moved with a devastating, effortless power, driving heavy iron nails into fresh, golden cedar shakes that he had somehow acquired before the sun had even fully crested the mountains. He was entirely focused, his rugged, weathered profile set in lines of quiet, unyielding determination. He was not just patching the small holes she had struggled with. He was completely restoring the integrity of the fragile structure. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her breath catching in her throat as she watched him work. No one in the righteous, judgmental town of Oakhaven had ever lifted a single finger to help her, let alone offer their grueling physical labor, without demanding a devastating price. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his presence here, bathed in the morning sun and quietly fixing her shattered world, made her feel incredibly small and profoundly unworthy. He paused, the heavy hammer resting effortlessly in his large, callous hand, and turned his dark, piercing gaze downward. When his eyes found her fragile silhouette standing in the shadows of the porch, the intense, dangerous stillness returned to his massive frame. He did not smile, but subtle, deep warmth seemed to soften the harsh angles of his jaw. "You should be inside by the fire," Elias called down, his deep, rumbling baritone carrying easily over the crisp, silent air of the valley. "The chill has not completely left your bones." Clara stepped out from the shadows, wrapping her arms defensively across her slender waist, feeling the heavy, familiar urge to push him away before he could discover the ruined truth of her life. "You should not be doing this, Mr. Thorne. I did not ask for your charity, and I have absolutely nothing to offer you in return for this labor." Elias stared down at her for a long, heavy moment, his dark eyes completely unreadable. He slowly descended the steep pitch of the roof, his heavy boots finding the rungs of a sturdy, unfamiliar wooden ladder he had brought from his own property. When his boots hit the muddy earth, the sheer, towering size of him instantly dwarfed the small yard. He walked toward her with that slow, predatory grace, closing the distance until he was standing just steps away from the porch, completely dominating her field of vision. "I did not ask for payment, Clara," he said quietly, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration that sent a sudden shiver down her spine. "A roof needs fixing to keep the winter out. It is as simple as that. There is no hidden debt being recorded here." He stepped past her, carrying the scent of fresh-cut cedar, worn leather, and wild morning air onto the porch. He walked directly into her small kitchen, moving with an easy, confident familiarity that made her incredibly nervous. Clara followed him tentatively, hovering near the doorway as she watched him open the canvas saddlebags he had left resting on her scarred wooden table. From the heavy bags, he pulled a thick slab of smoked bacon, a small burlap sack of cornmeal, and a brown paper package of ground coffee beans. He was systematically stocking her barren, empty shelves, entirely ignoring the profound, humiliating poverty that defined her existence. Clara felt a hot, shameful flush rise to her pale cheeks. She moved quickly toward the table, her delicate hands reaching out to stop him. "Please, you cannot do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperate pride and deep, agonizing humiliation. "You do not understand the people of this valley. If they see your horse tied in my yard, if they know you are spending your money and your time on a woman like me, they will turn their righteous backs on you as well. You'll be completely ruined here before you even begin." Elias stopped his movements, his massive hands resting flat against the rough wood of the table. He turned his head slowly, his intense, dark gaze locking onto her panicked, beautiful face. He did not look away, he did not step back, and he certainly did not look afraid of the invisible, looming threat of the town's judgment. "I have spent my entire life walking alone, Clara," he murmured, his deep voice resonating with harsh, unyielding truth. "I do not require permission or the approval of Oakhaven to decide where I tie my horse, or whose fire I choose to sit beside. Their whispers cannot touch me, and they will no longer touch you while I am standing here." Clara stared up at him, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. No man had ever spoken to her with such absolute, unwavering protection. Her late husband had cowardly hidden behind her delicate skirts when his debts came calling, leaving her to face the brutal, cruel wrath of the men he had cheated. Yet here was a towering, dangerous giant, willingly placing his massive shoulders between her fragile life and the crushing weight of the world. The morning passed in a quiet, surreal blur of shared domesticity. Elias cooked the heavy, smoked bacon over the fire, the rich, savory aroma completely filling the small cabin and painfully waking the deep, starving ache in Clara's stomach. They ate together at the small, scarred table, the silence between them no longer heavy with terror, but thick with a strange, compelling comfort. She watched him covertly from beneath her dark, sweeping lashes, mesmerized by the quiet strength in his large, scarred hands as he held the delicate porcelain coffee cup, entirely mindful of his own destructive power. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the towering pines, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley floor, the fragile, peaceful illusion they had built was abruptly shattered. The heavy, rhythmic sound of a horse approaching at a slow, deliberate trot drifted through the open window. Clara stiffened instantly, her slender body going completely rigid in the wooden chair. She recognized the harsh, uneven gait of the roan gelding belonging to Silas Vance, her late husband's older brother and the most ruthless, unforgiving man in the entire county. Silas held the majority of the impossible debts Arthur had left behind, and he took a cruel, twisted pleasure in regularly reminding Clara of her destitute, entirely trapped position. Through the window, Clara watched as Silas pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of her property line. The older man sat heavy in his saddle, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the newly repaired roof, the fresh lumber stacked neatly by the porch, and finally, the massive, imposing figure of Elias's black stallion grazing peacefully in the high grass. A dark, ugly sneer twisted Silas's face, his expression speaking volumes of the vile, venomous assumptions already forming in his mind. A sudden, suffocating panic gripped Clara's throat. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped violently against the floorboards, her instinct screaming at her to hide, to make herself entirely invisible before Silas could hurl his cruel insults. But before she could take a single, desperate step backward, a massive, warm hand wrapped gently but firmly around her trembling upper arm. Elias had risen from the table with terrifying, silent speed. He stood beside her, a towering, impenetrable wall of solid muscle and unyielding will. He did not look at her. His intense, shadowing gaze was locked entirely on the hostile rider at the edge of the yard. "Stay exactly where you are," Elias commanded softly, his deep voice carrying a dangerous, chilling edge that she had never heard before. He released her arm and walked slowly out the front door, stepping onto the porch with heavy, deliberate strides. He did not say a word to the man on the horse. He simply stood at the top of the wooden steps, his incredibly broad shoulders squared, his thumbs hooked casually into his heavy leather gun belt. The sheer, overwhelming physical menace radiating from the giant cowboy was palpable, completely swallowing the small, fragile yard in a heavy, suffocating tension. Silas Vance stared at the towering stranger, the arrogant sneer slowly melting from his face, replaced by a sudden, nervous hesitation. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his eyes darting from Elias's cold, unblinking stare to the heavy, iron-handled revolver resting on the cowboy's hip. Without speaking a single word, the older man abruptly, violently yanked his reins, turning his roan gelding and riding swiftly back toward the safety of the town. Clara stood in the doorway, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, entirely stunned by the bloodless, silent victory. Elias turned slowly back toward the cabin, the dangerous, predatory aura immediately dissolving as his dark eyes found her trembling figure. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into deep, velvet twilight. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped softly, casting warm, dancing shadows over the simple domestic scene. Elias was gathering his canvas duster from the chair, the day's labor entirely complete. The heavy, terrifying reality settled over Clara like a suffocating blanket. He had fixed her roof, he had fed her, and he had protected her from the cruelest man in the valley. There was absolutely no reason for him to stay any longer. As Elias reached for his dark Stetson, his large hand brushed against a small, worn leather ledger resting on the edge of a nearby bookshelf. The book fell open to the floor, the yellowed, stained pages revealing the long, devastating list of Arthur's gambling debts, the impossible, crushing numbers that kept Clara completely imprisoned in this desolate life. Elias slowly knelt, his large fingers picking up the fragile book. He stared down at the damning numbers for a long, heavy moment, the silence in the room stretching until it felt ready to snap. Clara closed her eyes, the familiar, bitter shame burning in her chest. This was the moment he would finally realize the true extent of her ruin. This was the moment the towering, quiet cowboy would turn his back and walk out into the night, leaving her to the cold. When she finally gathered the courage to open her sorrowful eyes, Elias was standing directly in front of her. He held the worn ledger in his massive hand, his intense, dark gaze burning into hers with sudden, overwhelming heat. "Why are you carrying the weight of a dead man's sins, Clara?" The heavy, suffocating silence of the cabin pressed inward, filled only by the soft, rhythmic snapping of the fire and the ragged, shallow sound of Clara drawing breath. She stood completely paralyzed beneath the warm, golden glow of the hearth, her beautiful, sorrowful eyes locked onto the small, battered leather ledger resting so effortlessly in Elias Thorne's massive, callous hand. Those yellowed, stained pages held the entirety of her absolute ruin, a meticulously documented history of every drunken gamble, every broken promise, and every cruel debt her late husband had chained to her fragile ankles before his death. She waited for the inevitable shift in the towering cowboy's dark eyes, bracing her fragile heart for the profound disgust and harsh judgment that always followed the discovery of her shameful reality. But Elias did not throw the book down in anger, nor did he look at her with the cold, righteous contempt she had suffered from the people of Oakhaven for 2 agonizing years. Instead, his intense, shadowing gaze remained locked onto her pale, trembling face, burning with sudden, overwhelming heat that seemed to strip away the very walls she had built around her shattered soul. He slowly stepped forward, closing the agonizing distance between them until she was entirely enveloped in the sheer, towering magnitude of his presence, the wild scent of pine and raw earth washing over her senses. "I asked you a question, Clara," he murmured, his deep, resonant baritone vibrating through the quiet space, commanding the absolute truth from the darkest corners of her heart. "Why are you carrying the weight of a dead man's sins?" The gentle, unyielding demand in his voice broke the final, brittle remnants of her composure. A hot, desperate tear slipped down her porcelain cheek, followed swiftly by another, until a silent, devastating wave of grief washed over her delicate frame. She wrapped her slender arms tightly across her waist, her gaze dropping in profound humiliation to the worn wooden floorboards. "Because the valley will not let me set them down," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread trembling in the heavy air. "Arthur owed money to dangerous, unforgiving men like his brother Silas, who hold the deed to this land like a loaded pistol against my head. Every time I walk into town, every time I try to trade for a simple bag of flour, they look at me and they see his failures. They see a woman who is fundamentally broken, stained by a scandal I had no part in creating but am completely forced to survive. I am drowning in a river I did not choose to step into, Elias, and there is no shore in sight." Elias absorbed her heartbreaking confession in absolute silence, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a slow, measured breath. He did not offer hollow, empty platitudes, and he did not insult her profound suffering with careless pity. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned his massive frame toward the blazing fireplace. He held the damning leather ledger out over the roaring, golden flames, the heat instantly curling the edges of the worn binding. Clara gasped sharply, a sudden, terrifying panic gripping her chest. She lunged forward instinctively, her delicate hands reaching out to grab his incredibly thick, muscular arm. "You cannot burn it," she cried out, her voice filled with sheer terror. "If you destroy the record, Silas will demand the entire sum immediately. He will take the land. He will throw me out into the freezing winter. You do not understand the cruelty of these men." Elias stopped, his large hand hovering directly above consuming fire. He slowly turned his head, looking down at her small, trembling hands gripping the heavy fabric of his sleeve. The sheer physical contrast between them was breathtaking, her fragile, translucent fingers pressing desperately against the unyielding, solid iron of his forearm. He gently lowered his arm, pulling the ledger away from the destructive flames. But he did not step back. He turned fully toward her, reaching out with his free hand to gently cup the side of her pale, tear-stained face. His incredibly rough, scarred palm was a shocking, grounding contrast against her soft skin, radiating an immense protective warmth that sent a profound shudder through her entire body. "I understand cruelty better than you could possibly know. Clara," he said softly, his dark, piercing eyes holding a dangerous, ancient promise. "But you need to understand this. You are no longer standing alone in that river. Silas Vance and the righteous cowards of this town have spent 2 years breaking the spirit of a woman who possesses more strength in her little finger than they have in their entire hollow lives. I will not let them take another piece of you." Over the next 2 weeks, the isolated, decaying farm underwent a silent, cinematic transformation. Elias did not return to his own vast property across the ridge. He stayed, working with a relentless, devastating power from the first pale, frosted light of dawn until the deep, velvet shadows of twilight swallowed the valley. He rebuilt the collapsed fences with massive, golden cedar posts, his heavy hammer echoing through the crisp autumn air like a steady heartbeat, bringing the dead land back to life. He chopped an immense, towering mountain of firewood, stacking it meticulously against the side of the cabin to ensure she would never face the bitter frost alone again. Clara watched him from the warmth of the kitchen, her sorrowful heart slowly, dangerously thawing with every passing day. They fell into a quiet, deeply intimate rhythm of shared domesticity that felt both incredibly fragile and profoundly eternal. She baked warm, golden bread, the rich, comforting scent filling the small cabin to welcome him when he stepped through the heavy wooden door, completely exhausted and covered in the honest dust of grueling labor. In the evenings, they sat together by the roaring hearth, the silence between them no longer heavy with terror, but charged with a beautiful, simmering tension. She would mend his torn canvas shirts, her delicate fingers moving gracefully in the flickering firelight, while he quietly whittled a piece of smooth river driftwood, his dark eyes constantly drawn to the soft, cascading waves of her dark chestnut hair and the gentle, breathtaking curve of her neck. He never crossed the boundary of absolute respect, his touches limited to a steadying hand on her slender waist as he passed behind her, or the slow, mesmerizing brush of his thick fingers against hers when she handed him a steaming cup of coffee. Yet, beneath the careful, restrained surface, a profound, overwhelming emotional connection was taking root, binding their shattered souls together with an invisible, unbreakable thread. Clara began to realize with a quiet, terrifying certainty that she was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with the giant, silent cowboy who had carried her out of the storm. But the harsh, unforgiving world outside their fragile sanctuary was not content to let them heal in peace. The town of Oak Haven watched the transformation of the Vance property with growing, venomous resentment. Whispers turned into malicious, roaring accusations within the smoky walls of the local saloon. Silas Vance, completely humiliated by his silent defeat in Clara's yard, began meticulously twisting the truth, painting Elias as a dangerous, violent interloper who was using the desperate, ruined widow to steal the valuable land from its rightful, legal owners. The righteous community, always eager to find a villain to justify their own cruelty, rallied behind Silas, completely eager to drive the towering stranger and the disgraced woman out of the valley for good. The darkest moment fell upon them on a brittle, freezing afternoon, when the sky was the color of bruised iron and the wind carried the bitter scent of an approaching blizzard. Clara was standing on the porch, wrapped tightly in Elias's heavy wool coat, watching him calm a restless, powerful horse in the corral. The quiet, peaceful illusion was abruptly shattered by the thunderous, terrifying sound of multiple riders approaching from the main road. Clara's heart plummeted into her stomach, a cold, suffocating dread instantly replacing the newfound warmth in her soul. A posse of 6 men rode into the yard, their heavy horses churning the frozen earth into sharp, muddy spikes. Leading the menacing group was Silas Vance, his face twisted into a triumphant, ugly sneer, and beside him rode Sheriff Miller, a weak, compliant man who carried a heavy roll of official parchment in his gloved hand. Elias released the horse and stepped slowly out of corral, his incredibly broad shoulders squaring as he moved to place his massive frame entirely between the hostile riders and the fragile woman on the porch. He did not reach for the heavy revolver strapped to his thigh, but the sheer, devastating physical menace radiating from him caused the advancing horses to nervously sidestep and toss their heads. "State your business, Miller," Elias rumbled, his deep voice carrying a dangerous, chilling edge that cut through the freezing wind like a sharpened steel blade. "You are trespassing on private land." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably under the giant cowboy's intense, unblinking stare, clearing his throat nervously before unrolling the heavy parchment. "I am acting on a legal, binding writ of foreclosure, Thorne. Arthur Vance left a sum of $2,000 outstanding to his brother, Silas. The grace period has completely expired. The widow Vance has until sunset today to produce the total sum in gold, or the property is legally forfeit, and she must vacate the premises immediately." Clara gripped the wooden railing of the porch, her knuckles turning completely white. $2,000 was an impossible mythical sum. She had nothing. The breath rushed from her lungs in a painful, ragged gasp, the crushing weight of the world finally crashing down to destroy the beautiful, fragile hope she had dared to build. Silas sat high in his saddle, his cold eyes burning with a cruel, vindictive joy as he watched her spirit completely shatter. Elias did not flinch. He did not look back at her. He stood like an immovable mountain in the frozen dirt, his dark eyes locked onto Silas with an overwhelming, silent fury. "You know exactly what you are doing, Vance," Elias said softly, the quiet volume of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. "You are using the law to murder a woman who has already paid for your brother's sins 1,000 times over." "The law is the law, boy," Silas spat, his courage bolstered by the 5 armed men surrounding him. "She is a ruined, worthless beggar, and you are a fool for dragging yourself down into the mud with her. Sunset, or my men will physically throw her out into the snow, and we will see if your massive shoulders can catch her then." The posse turned their horses, riding out of the yard and leaving a devastating, suffocating silence in their wake. The approaching blizzard finally broke, the first harsh, bitter flakes of snow beginning to fall from the iron sky. Clara stood paralyzed on the porch, her vision completely blurred by thick, hot tears of absolute despair. The beautiful dream was over. She was truly cursed, a permanent stain of ruin that destroyed everything it touched. Elias turned slowly, his heavy boots crunching against the freezing earth. He walked toward the porch, his rugged, weathered face etched with profound, quiet determination, but Clara could not bear to look at him. She turned and fled into the dark, cold cabin, slamming the heavy wooden door behind her. She leaned against the rough wood, sliding slowly to the floor as a deep, agonizing sob tore from her throat. She could not let Elias fight this unwinnable war. If he drew his gun against the sheriff, he would be hunted down and hanged as an outlaw. If he stayed, the town would completely destroy his reputation and his future. The only way to save the beautiful, towering man who had saved her life was to completely remove the source of the poison. She had to leave. She had to walk away into the freezing storm and completely disappear, taking her ruined name and her impossible debts far away from Oakhaven Valley forever. As she frantically began pulling her meager, threadbare clothes from the small wooden dresser, the heavy door slowly opened behind her. Elias stepped into the room, his massive presence instantly filling the suffocating space. He watched her packing, his intense, dark eyes taking the sheer, heartbreaking reality of her desperate sacrifice. "Where you think you are going, Clara?" he asked, his deep voice thick with profound, unyielding emotion. As Clara stands trembling with her worn leather satchel, preparing to step out into the merciless, Freezing winter to save the only man she has ever truly loved. Will the towering cowboy let her walk out his life forever, or will he finally reveal the impossible, powerful secret he has been holding back to save her shattered world? Clara stood frozen in the dim, freezing bedroom, her trembling fingers clutching a frayed woolen dress to her chest as if it were a shield against the crushing weight of the world. The heavy wooden door had clicked completely shut behind Elias, trapping them together in a profound, suffocating silence that was broken only by the violent howling of the approaching blizzard outside. The sheer, towering magnitude of the man filled the small space, his incredibly broad shoulders casting a massive, protective shadow over a fragile form. He did not look angry, but his rugged, weathered face was set in lines of absolute, unyielding determination, his intense. Dark eyes locking onto hers with a devastating heat that demanded nothing less than the absolute truth. "I am leaving, Elias," she whispered, her voice a broken, ragged thread that barely carried over the roar of the wind. "I am packing my things, and I am walking out of this valley before the sun sets. If I stay here, Silas will destroy this farm, and he will use the law to completely destroy you along with it. You are a good man, a towering, decent man who has already given me more kindness in 2 weeks than I have known in my entire life. I will not let my ruined, cursed existence drag you down into the mud." Elias stepped forward, his heavy boots making no sound on the wooden floorboards, moving with that devastating, deliberate grace that always made her breath catch in her throat. He reached out with his large, calloused hands, gently prying the worn dress from her numb, trembling fingers and dropping it carelessly onto the bed. He did not raise his voice, but the deep, resonant vibration of his baritone commanded the very air in the room, wrapping around her panicked heart like a heavy, grounding anchor. "You are not a curse, Clara," he murmured, his hands moving to gently grip her slender upper arms, his radiating warmth instantly chasing away the bitter chill of her despair. "You are the bravest, most breathtakingly resilient woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing. You have carried the impossible weight of a coward's debts on your fragile shoulders for 2 agonizing years, standing completely alone against the cruelest elements of this valley, and you have not broken. I did not step into that freezing storm to save a ruined woman. I stepped into the storm to save you." Clara shook her head desperately, hot tears spilling over her dark lashes and cascading down her pale, porcelain cheeks. "You do not understand the reality of this world, Elias. $2,000 is a mythical sum. It is an ocean we cannot possibly cross. If you try to stand against the sheriff with your gun, they will hang you. If you stay, you will lose everything you have built. Please, let me walk away so that you can be completely free." Elias stared down into her sorrowful, pleading eyes, his own dark gaze softening with profound, overwhelming tenderness that she had never thought she was worthy of receiving. He slowly released her arms, reaching up to gently cup the side of her delicate face, his rough thumb brushing away the steady stream of her tears. "When I rode into Oakhaven Valley, I was seeking a quiet place to lay down a very heavy past," he said softly, his voice a steady, rhythmic rumble that completely anchored her to the present moment. "I did not come here as a drifting, destitute cowboy, Clara. Before I sought the silence of these mountains, I spent 10 brutal years building and selling one of the largest cattle operations in the Southern Territories. I bought the land next to yours in absolute cash, and I have more than enough left over to buy this entire town if I so desired." Clara gasped sharply, her beautiful eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. She stared at the giant, quiet man before her, completely incapable of processing the monumental revelation. "You have the money?" she breathed, the words tasting like an impossible dream. Elias turned slowly, walking out into the main room and moving toward the heavy canvas saddlebags he had left resting by the hearth. Clara followed him on trembling legs, her heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. He unbuckled the thick leather straps, reaching deep inside the heavy canvas, and pulled out a large, heavy pouch made of dark, oiled leather. He carried it to the scarred wooden table and turned it over. A heavy, musical clatter filled the quiet cabin as dozens of solid gold double eagles spilled across the rough wood, catching the flickering, golden light of the fire in a blinding, triumphant display of absolute wealth. It was a fortune that completely dwarfed the impossible debt holding her captive, a glittering, undeniable testament to the quiet, devastating power this man wielded. "I am not buying your land, Clara," Elias stated, his deep voice carrying a solemn, unyielding vow. "I am buying your freedom. I am paying the ransom that this wicked town has held over your beautiful head, and I am cutting the chains that have kept you tied to a dead man's failures. You will never owe a single soul in this valley ever again." The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his sacrifice struck her like a physical blow. She reached out, her delicate fingers hovering over the gleaming gold, but she could not bring herself to touch it. "But Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound awe and deep, lingering fear. "Why would you spend this fortune on me? I am a widow with a ruined name. I have absolutely nothing to give you in return for this massive fortune." Elias stepped around the table, completely ignoring the scattered gold, and closed a final, agonizing distance between them. He stood so close that the wild, intoxicating scent of pine and rain-soaked leather enveloped her entirely. He reached out, his massive hands gently framing her delicate face, tilting her head back until she was completely captured in his intense, burning gaze. "I do not want your land, and I do not want your payment, Clara," he murmured, his deep voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration that sent a violent, beautiful shudder crashing through her entire body. "I want the woman who fought a freezing storm with bleeding hands to keep a roof over her head. I want the woman who bakes bread to welcome me from the cold, and whose quiet, fragile smile is the only light I ever want to see at the end of a grueling day. You are worth every single piece of gold on this table, and I will spend my entire life proving it to you if you will simply let me stay." Before Clara could form a single word of response, the heavy, muffled sound of horses returning to the yard completely shattered the deeply intimate moment. The sun had finally sunk below the jagged peaks, plunging the valley into the deep, violent darkness of the blizzard. Silas Vance and the sheriff had returned, bringing with them the full, cruel force of the law to finally destroy the fragile widow. Elias did not flinch. He slowly dropped his hands from her face, his broad shoulders squaring as the quiet, dangerous predator returned to his massive frame. He swept a heavy pile of gold coins back into the dark leather pouch, pulling the drawstrings tight. "Stay behind me," he commanded softly, moving toward a heavy wooden door with the unstoppable, deliberate momentum of a rising tide. Clara followed him, wrapping her frayed shawl tightly around her trembling shoulders, her heart pounding with a chaotic mixture of sheer terror and brilliant, blinding hope. Elias kicked the door open, stepping out onto the small porch. The howling wind instantly whipped the canvas of his duster around his towering legs, the bitter, driving snow completely blinding the yard. Silas Vance sat atop his roan gelding, his face completely wrapped in a heavy scarf, a lantern swinging violently from his saddle horn. The sheriff sat nervously beside him, surrounded by the freezing, miserable posse. They looked completely ready to tear the cabin apart, eager to enforce their cruel, righteous will upon the ruined woman. "Time is up, Thorne," Silas shouted over the roaring wind, his voice dripping with venomous, triumphant glee. "The sun has set. Get the widow out here now, or my men will drag her out by her pretty dark hair." Elias walked slowly down the wooden steps, stepping directly into the freezing, churning mud of the yard. He completely ignored the posse, his intense, dark eyes locked entirely on the cruel older man. He walked right up to the side of Silas's horse, standing so incredibly close that the animal nervously tossed its head, completely intimidated by the giant cowboy's overwhelming physical presence. Without a single word, Elias raised his massive right arm, holding the heavy, clinking leather pouch up into the dim, violent light of the lantern. "Count it, Miller," Elias rumbled, his deep voice cutting through the shrieking blizzard like a heavy iron blade. $2,000 in solid, legal gold coin. The debt of Arthur Vance is completely paid in full. The sheriff leaned down from his saddle with trembling hands. Taking the heavy pouch from the towering cowboy, he untied the leather strings. Peering inside as the golden light reflected off the incredible fortune, the older man's eyes widened in absolute, terrified shock. He looked at Elias, then looked over at Silas, who was sitting completely frozen in his saddle, his venomous sneer melting into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. "It is all here, Silas," the sheriff stammered, his voice completely devoid of its former arrogant authority. "In fact, it looks to be completely over the required sum. The foreclosure is legally null and void. The land remains the sole, undisputed property of the widow Vance." Silas stared at the heavy leather pouch, his face turning an ugly, mottled red beneath his scarf. He looked down at Elias, completely paralyzed by the sudden, devastating reversal of his cruel victory. "You cannot do this," Silas spat, his voice trembling with a pathetic, impotent rage. "This is family business. You have absolutely no right to interfere in the lawful debts of my blood." Elias took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sheer, crushing menace of his massive frame forcing Silas's horse to back away in terror. "I have every right in the world, Vance," Elias said softly, his voice a dangerous, quiet promise that completely silenced the howling wind. "Because from this moment forward, Clara Vance is entirely under my protection. If you or any of your cowardly men ever set foot on this property again, if I ever even hear you speak her name in the saloon, I will not bother calling the sheriff. I will handle the trespass myself. Do you completely understand me?" Silas swallowed hard, his cruel eyes darting rapidly between the massive, unyielding cowboy and the heavy iron revolver strapped securely to his thigh. He yanked his reins violently, turning his horse without speaking another word, and rode swiftly out of the yard, completely swallowed by the blinding, freezing darkness of the tempest. The sheriff quickly signed a heavy piece of official parchment, handing it down to Elias before turning the rest of the miserable posse around and following Silas in absolute, humiliating defeat. Elias stood completely alone in the raging blizzard, watching the riders disappear until there was nothing left but the swirling white snow. He turned slowly, his heavy boots crunching against the frozen earth, and walked back up the wooden steps. He stepped onto the porch, handing the officially stamped, legally binding deed of release to Clara. She took the heavy parchment in her trembling hands, her tear-filled eyes staring down at the beautiful, impossible proof of her absolute salvation. She was entirely free. The suffocating, agonizing chains of her past had been completely shattered, washed away by the unwavering, overwhelming strength of the towering man standing before her. Elias reached out, gently wrapping his heavy wool coat around her shivering shoulders, pulling her entirely against the hard, solid warmth of his massive chest. As Clara pressed her tear-stained face into the comforting curve of his neck, breathing in the wild, intoxicating scent of the man who had just conquered her darkest demons, a beautiful, terrifying question fluttered in the quiet depths of her newly freed heart. He had completely saved her life, but was she finally brave enough to truly give him her soul? The morning sun crested the jagged, snow-capped peaks of Oakhaven Valley, casting a brilliant, blinding blanket of pure diamond light across a world that had been completely reborn in the frozen night. The violent, howling blizzard had finally exhausted its terrible fury, leaving behind profound, unbroken silence that felt entirely different from the heavy, isolating quiet Clara Vance had known for 2 agonizing years. This new silence was not a heavy tomb of despair, but a vast, open cathedral of pure, breathtaking possibility. Clara stood near the frosted window of her small bedroom, her slender fingers tracing the delicate, intricate ice crystals clinging to the glass. She looked down at the heavy, officially stamped parchment resting on the small wooden dresser. It was not a dream. The impossible, crushing debts that had shackled her fragile spirit. To a dead man, sins were completely gone, washed away by the unwavering, towering strength of a man who refused to let her drown. She dressed slowly in the freezing room, pulling on a thick, soft woolen sweater that Elias had quietly purchased for her during his trips into town, its heavy folds carrying the faint, intoxicating scent of pine and raw earth that always clung to his skin. When she opened a heavy wooden door and stepped out into the main cabin, the roaring hearth had already chased away the bitter frost, filling the small space with deep, radiating heat. Elias Thorne was standing near the glowing fire. His massive back turned to her as he methodically fed fresh cedar logs into the dancing golden flames. He had not returned to his own sprawling property across the ridge. He had stayed, sleeping in the heavy wooden chair beside the hearth, completely standing guard over her newly won freedom. Clara walked softly across the floorboards, the profound, overwhelming gratitude in her heart swelling until it threatened to completely steal her breath. She stopped just a few feet behind his towering, imposing frame, her sorrowful eyes taking in the sheer, physical magnitude of the man who had traded a massive fortune for her ruined life. "You are still here," she whispered, her fragile voice trembling in the warm, quiet air. Elias turned slowly, the heavy, rugged lines of his weathered face softening instantly as his dark, piercing gaze found her standing in the morning light. He brushed the rough bark from his large, calloused hands, moving toward her with that devastating, deliberate grace that completely commanded the very gravity of the room. "I told you last night, Clara," he murmured, his deep, resonant baritone vibrating through the quiet space, wrapping around her healing heart like a heavy, protective anchor. "I am not going anywhere. The storm is over and the debts are paid, but my place is right here, standing between you and the cold, for as long as you allow me to stay." Clara looked up into his intense, burning eyes, the final, brittle walls of her deep emotional trauma finally crumbling into dust beneath the steady, overwhelming heat of his devotion. For 2 years, she had believed she was completely unworthy of kindness, a broken, stained woman condemned to suffer in the shadows of a cruel, righteous town. But this giant, quiet cowboy did not see a ruined widow. He saw a survivor. He saw a woman whose immense, quiet strength had weathered the darkest, most agonizing storms. And he had completely leveled his own world just to stand beside her. "I have nothing left to hide behind, Elias," she said softly, her delicate hands reaching out to gently rest against the solid, unyielding iron of his broad chest. "I have spent so long believing I was entirely invisible, completely erased by the cruelty of this valley. But when you look at me, I feel like I am completely, beautifully seen. I am entirely terrified, but I do not want you to leave. I want you to stay forever." Elias reached down, his incredibly rough, massively callous hands gently enveloping her slender, trembling fingers, holding them securely against his violently beating heart. A profound, breathtaking tenderness washed over his rugged features, completely transforming the dangerous predator into a deeply vulnerable, devoted man. "You were never invisible to me, Clara," he vowed, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that sent a sudden, beautiful shudder crashing through her fragile frame. "From the very first moment I saw you fighting that freezing rain on the roof, I knew I was looking at the strongest, most breathtakingly beautiful woman in the entire world. You do not need to be terrified anymore. We are going to build a completely new life on this land. A life where the only whispers you will ever hear are the wind in the pines and the sound of my voice telling you how profoundly you are loved." He slowly lowered his heavy, dark head, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Clara did not step back. She completely surrendered to the overwhelming, magnetic pull of his immense presence, rising slightly on her toes as his warm, firm lips finally met hers in a gentle, devastatingly tender kiss. It was not a desperate, chaotic collision, but a slow, reverent sealing of an ancient, unbreakable promise. The profound, quiet intimacy of the moment completely filled the small cabin, a powerful, emotional redemption that completely erased the bitter, tragic shadows of her past. She was no longer a ruined widow fighting for survival in a merciless world. She was a cherished, deeply protected heart of a towering, magnificent cowboy. In the years that followed, the isolated, decaying farm was completely transformed into a sprawling, prosperous ranch that stood as a shining, undeniable testament to the incredible power of resilience and true love. The cruel, judgmental whispers of Oakhaven Valley were entirely silenced by the massive, unyielding success of Elias Thorne and the breathtaking, confident grace of his beautiful wife. Clara learned that true inner strength is not just the ability to endure agonizing pain in silence, but the profound, overwhelming courage to let go of the past, to embrace your own inherent worthiness, and to allow yourself to be completely, fiercely loved. The harsh, unforgiving frontier had tried completely break her spirit, but instead, it had forged a beautiful, unbreakable bond between a fragile survivor and a giant protector, proving that even in the darkest, most bitter winters of our lives, the promise of a warm, brilliant spring is always waiting to be discovered.